Welcome everybody to this second edition of this particular learning lab on behalf of KDVI, where we are offering you an opportunity to connect with your peers and have created a place where we can really have some time to reflect and think about some of the issues that are coming up in the world at the moment as a result of what's been happening. And also talk a little bit about how we, either as clients or as consultants or as coaches, are responding to that, both practically and emotionally. So this learning lab, as you're aware, is called What Genies Have Been Let Out of the Bottle, as a response to this sort of COVID-19 crisis that may never actually be reinterred. And we're going to spend the next hour and a half talking about and thinking about that. So the methodology that we have for this particular learning lab is a little different to the other ones that we've run. If you were not at the previous one that Claire and I ran, you'll understand that it's a little different. What's going to happen is, after I've set out a few ground rules, Claire and I are going to engage each other in a little bit of dialogue for about 10 minutes and talk about a few things that hopefully spark some impressions, some emotions, some thoughts and reflections, at which point we're going to break you all out and give you an opportunity to talk with each other for quite some considerable time, a little bit longer than in the previous learning labs. But a few hygiene measures first. Number one, while we're talking, it'd be great if everyone stays on mute. I think you're probably familiar with that as a protocol nowadays. There will be 2 breakouts, as I said. You will be flies on the wall, listening to Claire and I talk about a few things, and then you'll be broken out. Just before we break you out, I'm going to give you an opportunity to do some journaling. So one thing that you will need for this session is a pen and a piece of paper or your electronic. Thank you. Nice, Chantal. You're well prepared, I see. Electronic notepad so that you can write some stuff down before we actually put you into the breakout rooms. We're going to give you a 30-minute breakout, really chance to connect with your peers. And then when you come back, what we're going to ask you to do is write down your impressions or your thoughts or reflections actually on the chat board rather than contribute them verbally in the interests of time. So write down, make sure there's a note taker for your group and write down a few things on the chat board. And then if you have a question, what we're going to invite you to do is come back with a question, something that you might want to pose to the general assembly here, or maybe just to Claire or to me. That will be entirely up to you. Then we'll do that one more time, rather more quickly. There'll be a 10-minute chat and a 10-minute breakout, and then we'll close. So that's the general protocol. We aim to finish at 2:30 European time, 1:30 UK time. If you're anywhere else in the world, I'm sorry, you're going to have to figure out what time that will be, but in around 90 minutes from now. All right, Claire, did I miss anything?
I think that's covered everything.
Okay, great, good. So with the spirit of all of that said, let's get started. And Claire, you and I have been talking a number of times over the last several weeks about really what this crisis means. It's creating and generating a lot of new meaning for people. And we thought we would start our conversation today by thinking about the individual and what it's really meaning for individuals and how the world has changed in a way that it may not go back to being the way we expected it was when we went into it. And I think you've got some thoughts, first of all, about transition and what transition looks like. And so maybe we could use that as our jumping off point, and then we can dive into some other things that are going on.
Yes, I mean, I think the reason we thought this was an interesting topic and for 2 of us to actually participate in having a discussion is that it kind of partly builds on the session that Roger Lehman did on fault lines, where we're looking at sort of structural divisions that are emerging or have been crystallized by the COVID crisis. But also, I think it was leading into, well, are there shifts that are at a system level that are happening that we are beginning to become aware of and that however much people want to go back to business as usual, then actually something will have shifted that will mean that those changes will not revert back to how they were. And one model that I think is quite useful is the bridges model. And I don't know, Alicia, if you have the slide of it. If you haven't, don't worry, I can just talk through it. And the bridges model is interesting because it looks at transition, and it looks at transition from there being an ending, going into sort of a neutral zone where things emerge and develop and create and die and emerge, and there's quite a lot of uncertainty, and then going into a final emergent phase, which is a beginning where things become much clearer. And we've been running these learning labs now for 6 weeks. Yeah. And I think we've been having this conversation 6 weeks ago, we'd have been very much in the ending and moving into this sort of neutral emergent transition zone. Whereas now I think we've been in this space for, well, around the globe, 3-4 months. We're now coming into a space where we're certainly starting to see changes which are being touted as the new normal, a phrase which I think is perhaps a little bit premature, because I don't think anyone knows where everything's going to land. But we're certainly in a neutral zone. There's some ending, there's some losing, there's some letting go, but we haven't really got to what the new way of working will be. And also the fact that the new way of working is going to be different for different people. And I'll just make one comment, which is I've just come off a session with 20 graduate students at Central St Martin's, which is our main design university in the UK. And their perspective of what the new beginning is very different to the people who come on these kinds of calls, who we heard from a couple of weeks ago, and I'll bring that in as we go through. So I think the bridges model is useful just in terms of thinking about the fact that we're in a time of structural shifts, but we're not necessarily at a point where we have absolute clarity about what it is going to be, other than we know it's not going to necessarily be binary, it's not going to be an either or. There are going to be all sorts of different things that come out of this, which will apply to different groups, different categories, different situations. And I think we need to be alert to the fact that certainty isn't necessarily helpful at the moment, but openness to the future is. I don't know, is that helpful, Graham?
Yeah, it is. And, you sparked a few things as you were talking. I mean, first of all, 2 weeks ago when we were having this conversation, which seems like an eon ago, the world was quite different. And how different? Well, we were talking about on that call a survey that you and I had both just read, where we'd noted that trust in governments across the world had gone up exponentially during this crisis and was at a high for the last sort of 30 years. And trust in organisations had dropped through the floor. Interestingly, in the 2-week intervening period, it seems that that's gone into very, very sharp reverse. And what we notice now, people are becoming quite militant about the way their governments are handling the situation, especially here in the UK, definitely in the United States. And people are starting to be much more aggressive about pointing out errors. What I suspect is also happening, again, it's just a hunch and you may disagree, is that trust in organisations is starting to come back as we re-emerge, certainly in Western Europe, and in the US, people are already moving very quickly back out into the world. I suspect that people are starting to put their trust back in organisations to do the right thing, to support them and pay them, and to create this new normal. And that may be even crass to suggest that that's reflected in stock prices, which have actually been rallying for the last couple of weeks. And even airline stocks, which at one point were almost sort of bankrupt, are now actually looking to be sort of perking up a little bit. And I wonder if we're sort of moving towards a different phase of that transition.
I think that's really interesting. So it's something I think a lot about. And I both agree and disagree with you, because obviously I'm a lawyer and I can do both. And I can charge you twice, which is fantastic. But I kind of agree that some businesses are gaining more trust. But I also think that something else is happening. And there was a very interesting article in the FT, I think it was yesterday or the day before, which is basically saying, look, companies that are going to survive this are those who've got, it's not rocket science, those that have got robust balance sheets. And companies that are heavily indebted and have essentially used debt to return money to investors or to allow acquisition by private equity are in fact incredibly fragile, and they're essentially house of cards. And they are the ones that tend to be overly reliant on 0-hour contract and what I call pseudo gig economy workers, who are in gig economy, but not by choice, but by the structural requirements of the industry. And I think what you're hearing investors saying is that where companies are behaving appropriately, broadly, trust is coming back. Where companies are being revealed to be poor corporate citizens, then what I think you're seeing is both the stock market investor base and the confidence of individuals, of sort of consumers. I think that is not necessarily coming back in terms of trust. I think, however, and I think this is an interesting point, I think that ultimately we have a habit of consumption as a society, and that if we come out of this quickly, relatively quickly, that habit of consumption will, to a certain extent, come back. And you're seeing that with the sort of the desire of the return of low-cost carriers in the airline industry, that they know that if they don't get back soon enough, then actually habits change, and it takes something like 3 to 4 months for habits to change. So these systemic changes are still swirling around, and I think trust touches on so many different areas that, you know, what it does is it really highlights the sort of the fluidity that we're seeing at the moment in the system.
You reminded me that when people emerged from lockdown in China, for the first time ever, they saw something happen which was known as revenge buying, where people that had not been able to buy anything for about 6 weeks went out and spent thousands of pounds to the extent that they could on luxury goods for themselves. But that may be a very country specific thing. You just reminded me of this habit of consumption. But I'm seeing two things, both at an individual level and I think at an organizational level, that I think are salient to what you just talked about. Number one, and again, 5 bits of data, but might be useful, may not. I found, talking with a group of people from a financial services firm a few days ago, that people were saying that the social contract with their firm had been breached because they were not only working harder than ever, but actually, and that's partly because, of course, they had no commute. So they would literally switch on at 8 in the morning and finish at 6 in the evening, or sometimes 7 in the evening. But also, there was an expectation that they would work at weekends. And one person said, you know, I was called 8 times last weekend by my boss, which has never happened before. In other words, the expectation is that people will go well above and beyond what they've been used to doing in the service of their organization. Now, that's one thing. Yeah, go on.
Because one of the, I work quite a lot around sort of professional services, and flexible working has been highly desired and incredibly difficult to implement certainly in sort of elite professional services. And I remember having a conversation with someone who said, my team, they can't work from home. You know, they have to be in the office to work. And I remember saying to him, well, but you seem to be happy with them working flexibly at the weekend. And, you know, it's okay for them to work from home at the weekend. And I think what you're highlighting is the fact that when flexible working becomes normality, there is a risk that the concept of the ideal worker extends beyond the professional sphere into the whole sphere of an individual's life. Yeah.
Well, the other, I think that's a very good point. And I would just want to elevate that before we sort of switch into something else, because you touched on it in what you said very eloquently, but I wanted to expand it, namely that, you know, shareholder value for many years now has been a sort of the bête noire of the way we should think about the metrics of an organization. But now it's got to be expanded much more quickly and much more broadly. And again, for the first time, there's this notion of B to S, which is business to society. And that incorporates all the different stakeholders. And my feeling is that the tolerance that people have for an organization that either does not live up to its espoused purpose, or that does not have a decent espoused purpose, will lose its talent. I don't think people are going to be prepared to tolerate that for much longer, except that many people are bound in because they feel lucky to have a job. But the minute those shackles are released, I suspect we're going to see a lot of shift societally. Anyway, with all of that said, I think we've said quite a lot of stuff and opened the ground for all these terrific people out there who have been listening in to actually talk amongst themselves. So maybe we can turn outwards to all of you. We've got a lot of people online now, about 45 people. Alicia, if we could show them our second slide, which is really just to pose you all a question and have you think broadly, first of all, what has changed for everybody as individuals and how will it affect you, in your opinion, going forward? And also, what has changed for organizations and how will it affect organizations going forward? Welcome back, everybody. We hope that you've had a great conversation with each other. I'm going to just remind you and invite you to put any remarks, high-level themes, things that really, triggered you or, caused you to reflect more deeply onto the chat board. And then maybe pose to you the question, do you have any questions? Are there any resounding questions that came up that we could usefully toss around between ourselves over the next 15, 20 minutes?
If you do, can you just put your hand up in the participant box? The little blue hand would be lovely. Or any observations, anything you'd like to share? Otherwise you'll just have to listen to me and Graham talk.
Yeah, which is like a penalty. So, if you really don't want to do that, then you should probably ask a question.
Oh, Neil, well done, Nell.
Hi. So we had a very interesting discussion in our group about the kind of profound fear that's around at the moment, both around death, but also around the fear of life. So the fear of how to survive if you're somebody who's, very much on the breadline. And so our question back to the group was, if people agree that this is a theme, that fear is a big theme, then what do they think will be the next iteration of its impact?
Great question. Nell, do you want Claire and I to have a go at it while the group thinks, or would you rather hear from the group? It's up to you. Maybe you're tired of us by now.
No, we'd be delighted for you to have a go.
Okay. Claire, do you want to do that, or shall I?
Funnily enough, we were actually talking about, we didn't frame it as fear, but we were framing it as the fact that what we think has changed in the last 2 weeks from when we did this session previously is that last time we were talking about the fact that when you return to work, the whole group focused on people like us returning to work, sort of elite knowledge workers who were sort of trying to work out how to navigate a virtual and real world with sort of dislocated working. And the challenge I made to the group back then was, why aren't we talking about frontline workers? Why aren't we talking about people who are at other levels of the socioeconomic system or the workforce? And what I think we've seen certainly in the UK in the last 2 weeks change is that suddenly what you call frontline workers, manual workers, workers who are on 0-hour contracts, workers who are in construction, workers who can't work from home, are now being told to go back to work. And they're being told to go back to work with relatively loose advice on what is safe and what is not safe, and relatively little thought given to the actual impact that that might have on them as a community or a group. And so if I'm a security guard or a tube worker, I'm much more likely to be infected simply because of my proximity to other people, but I don't have a choice whether or not I go back, unless for some reason I'm vulnerable or shielded. And so now I think your question is really interesting, because I think what it highlights is the fact that for certain groups and individuals, there is still a lack of choice which exists within the terms of the response to coronavirus. And that lack of response enhances and increases the fear from being not only financial, but also being physical as well. And that then comes down to, well, how do the government support individuals? How do employers protect individuals? what is society willing to allow to happen to notional groups? Is it okay for old people to die? We said we wouldn't actually say this out loud, but is it okay for old people to die at the expense of opening the economy? Is it okay for tube workers to be more at risk at the expense of getting the economy going? And I think that what is going to happen next in some part depends on how society looks after each other and how much compassion we can find in society as well. I'm not sure, Graham, if you want to add anything to my rambling answer.
Take a different slant, and I'll make it a little, maybe a bit simplistic. I mean, I think it's a very eloquent answer that you've given, but I think the answer is it depends. And what does it depend on? It depends on leadership. And why? Because the watered down version of fear is anxiety, and there is a pandemic of anxiety in our society anyway. If you take the COVID-19 thing away, we especially see that in the younger generation. There's a lot of anxiety around. How do you resolve anxiety? Well, for many of you that are either therapists or have thought about this from an emotional perspective, of course, there are cures for that. But the reality is that you need leaders around that give people hope. And the hope has to be realistic. It cannot be blind hope, but it has to be something that people can attach themselves to and feel secure and safe. And in a sense, what I'm saying here is there will be, for a period of time, some dependency. I think we have been very dependent on our governments to get it right. That dependency will shift from governments to organizational leaders to get it right and to try to do the right thing for us in general. And I think then the anxiety will resolve itself. I suspect, though, Mel, what it will be replaced with will be a deep questioning. And that's what I'm starting to see, is that people will say, okay, so I'm not scared anymore, I'm not fearful anymore. I think I know where we are and what's going to happen, but do I really want this? And I think it will be replaced with that.
Nell, do you have any thoughts to come back to us? Or does anyone have any other comments that they'd like to make? Maybe do pop your hand up. Oh, that's a physical hand pop.
Yes, I can't see how to do it on this iPad.
That's an example of the analog world in the digital space.
And I also have a miniaturized word processor. In a sense, this loss of freedom. My suspicion is one of the things going on is that's been going on for quite a while, is our fear of global power shifting towards China and a much more authoritarian way of doing things. And it's really interesting that what we're doing is taking the shed load of people like tube drivers and stuff and treating them in a very, very authoritarian way. You go back to work and it doesn't matter if you die. So actually we're taking on precisely the thing about China we don't like under the guise of this disease. We're also expecting our leaders to do something. And it gets really interesting that with honourable exceptions like Angela Merkel, many of our leaders have responded in a way that's actually fueling anxiety rather than discharging it, and is quite authoritarian. I think almost the Trump style approach, which is to make people anxious and then present himself as the answer, which again is the authoritarian model which we might well be afraid of and therefore making happen because the fear is almost unbearable. So some quite tricky stuff we're navigating there. I love the idea that this might end up with some questioning, but I also wonder whether the sense for many people is going to be them as has got the resources can do the questioning can do it, but actually my day-to-day struggle for survival has squeezed that out, which again loops us back into authoritarian direction, which might mean the political question is actually how to mobilize the sort of leadership that's able to say, yes, we have a problem, and here's a way to engage with it that doesn't involve demonizing people.
So Chantal.
Hello. Yes, the thought that came to mind after Graham just spoke, and harking back to our discussion in the breakout session, one of the people there who's a manager of a team is actually noting that the need for a coaching role as a manager has become heightened more than a directing role as a leader. And one of the things that always worries me when I see people appeal for leaders that give hope has again to do with the authoritarian result that might have if it's looking for a sort of unconditional hope. There's a great title of a book called Hope Without Optimism that I haven't read yet, but I think there's a great tendency for leaders to want to be the optimist, and from that sense of hope, have others follow them into their direction. And I think there's a danger if we start amplifying that towards authoritarianism and towards blind following. And there's much that I don't like about the way my country in the Netherlands is being led, but one of the things I did like was the idea that there was a constant appeal by our government for us as citizens to not lose our own brains, and to keep thinking actively how we as participants of this society can actively contribute to the well-being of the whole. And I think that there's this phase set by some people I know that say, we have, how did they call it again? Outsourced our anxiety for uncertainty towards certainty merchants, trying to look for the knowing, the expertise, the certainty, the hope, the trust. And I think what I really liked was an article that came out by INSEAD professor Gianpiero Petrieri the other day on how it's maybe now it's time to learn as leaders to be holding and to be assisting in containing all the anxiety that's there, not with a false illusion of hope that everything will be all right, but as a development space for us all, where we can learn to stay with not knowing what will be. And I sort of wanted to make that appeal as I heard Graham speak a second ago. Thank you.
And I think it's really good that a number of KDVI clients are working with some of the KDVI coaches on leadership reflection circles, which is aiming to do exactly that kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons why this space exists, actually, is to actually be able to say, nobody knows. Why don't we come together and actually put our heads together rather than just look at certainty? So I think that's absolutely spot on. Sorry, Graham.
No, not at all. Maybe then I'll come back on what Mark said, because I think this is an interesting idea that I was exploring yesterday. And I think, Mark, you've hit the nail on the head there, which is, you know, are we yet at a stage in our democracies and in society for us to be able to come together in our different constituencies and supplant the partisan divide that we've all seen and experienced over the last several years, especially in the United States? And for example, where I'm living, you know, we've had this whole Brexit debate that's been rumbling away for years. But in many countries, there is this sort of, you know, there's this feeling that we need to fight in order to get to the best solution. Is it possible that we could get there through discussion, through constructive developmental discussion? And that requires all parties. I mean, it comes into what Heifetz talks about. When he talks about adaptive leadership, he says you need to bring in all the constituencies, and potentially constituencies you hadn't even thought of, in order to solve these most complex problems. Well, here we are. And my worry, my own anxiety, my own fear is that we will slip back very easily into the sort of the Punch and Judy show, as we call it in the UK, people just throwing things at each other because it's understandable and it's populist, but it's not going to solve anything. And I think we have a very important dilemma here to solve in the world, and, you know, amongst many. But Mark, I can't say on that one. I'm very hopeful.
I think it also links into sort of the wider point that somebody I know has used this phrase collective carelessness, and actually, you know, if we don't understand our individual roles and our individual contributions, we are at risk of sleepwalking into a systemic change that is going to happen to us rather than one that we help shape.
Yeah.
And so I think this concept of collective carelessness, which I have shamelessly borrowed, is a really interesting one, because it can feel so overwhelming that we don't actually take steps ourselves. And yet, until somebody takes steps, until we take personal ownership, the system will change regardless of our hopes if we don't take action.
Right, and the action doesn't have to be militant action. And it's interesting to see how different societies have responded to this. And, you know, if you look at Sweden as a prime example of a society that's empowered its citizens and said, we rely on you to do the right thing. You know, this thing is around, you know who it affects, broadly speaking. We expect you to use, let's just call it common sense. Whereas, as you know, Chantal was saying, there, you know, in some cases you have leaders who essentially will use this sort of the adherence of, I'm going to tell you how this works and I'm going to give you hope that we'll go through it and get through it. But in return for that, I expect your blind loyalty, not only now, but for the next several years to come. In other words, it's an excuse to create an authoritarian regime. And this is, I mean, we're now loosely slipping into what we were going to talk about, which is how is this going to affect society more broadly going forward? And how do we resist that in a way that is more sophisticated, less militant, but so that we can shape the future, which is called transition, rather than have the future changed for us, which is something that we'll just be subject to. And I think, you know, there's some interesting things to discuss around there as well.
Great. Put 3 more hands up.
Yeah.
You take 3 more quick questions, and then
yeah.
if we're staying in this societal discussion, it may be that it's time to quickly move back into the breakout groups. So, Mauricio.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to bring the conversation from a leadership responsibility to an individual type of responsibility in my mind. It seems to me that one way of looking at what's happening is this idea of an avoidance of loss, failure, pain, death, scarcity at every level, what I would describe as the grandiosity of individuals and societies, certainly Western societies, Europe and so on. So the idea of failure and problem and so on is denied almost, to a point that in my mind, one way of looking at what's happening is a collective projection of all that shadow into a problem that represents everything that we've been avoiding for centuries, if not thousands of years, the chaos type of thing. So one way of looking personal responsibility is that idea of accepting that failure, pain, death, and the rest is a part of life. And as such, we need to learn to live with that anxiety. That's the first projection that I would avoid. And certainly the second projection that I would avoid is this idea of expecting leaders to resolve the issue. Yes, there is a need to a collective type of response. The idea of expecting the solution to come from the top is in my mind almost like children expecting parents to come up with a solution. So this, in my mind, is a fantastic opportunity to finally walk on the planetary umbilical cord that we have created with companies, organizations, leaders, and so on, and accept the cost of personal freedom, of personal liberties, which at the end of the day is personal responsibility for looking after ourselves, including our own death and our own pain.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think it is interesting. I think there is also something I've been thinking about is the need to reframe the idea of winners and losers as well. And actually, what does it mean to give in a society, and what does it mean to receive in a society? I think it's something that fits into that as well, because at the moment it's very much driven, certainly in our world, by financial. And actually, I think what you're talking about is something much more connected. And it's fascinating.
I like the idea of sort of unwarranted and unfulfilled expectations of leadership, Maurizio. I mean, it harks back to the sort of the basic leadership theory, which is that everyone is a leader, and we actually now stand up and be counted for that. We can expect certain things in a crisis, but we should hold those loosely, and that should morph very quickly into we have collective responsibility in organizations, in society, you name it. So I think that's a beautiful point. Thank you.
But I also think that it raises the question that when you take power away from people who are in established leadership positions and you distribute it, how do you get them to let go without a sense of loss?
Well, hopefully they are sophisticated enough to be able to do that. If they've moved into a debate, yes, I know, but you know, then don't.
That's a point of what's been a natural state of life.
I've just realised I've fallen into my own trap. Christelle, and then we will move on.
Yeah, if I can unmute myself, yes. It was just a reflection as we were discussing, and something that happened this morning, which I think goes in the way of what we're discussing. I was in a board meeting and we had a very busy agenda. And before we even started, so we welcome everyone, and before we went into the first agenda item, one board member raised his hand and said, may I have the floor? Before we go in any further, I need to share something. And he simply said, allow me the space and time to do that, because I don't know how I'm going to say it. It's just, I have to say it. And he basically shared that the previous board meeting was very tensed, and he did not like that. So he basically very eloquently said to all of us, if it's the way that business is going to be, then I want out, because this is not what I'm part of a board. I'm part of a board to make better decision, better progress in the society, and it elevated the debate. But if the way we did it, like last time, really hurts the relationship, then I do not want to proceed. And we went on for 45 minutes because everybody then expressed how they felt for the last board meeting, which was extremely tensed. And I was like, whoa. And we didn't cover at all the agenda. We actually had to reschedule something. I felt that, would that have happened 10 years ago? No, it was really the fact that people had time to think, and he completely hijacked the agenda. But at the end, everybody jumped on his wagon and shared and opened and spoke up. And I felt that was, so yes, we shouldn't, I agree with Maurizio, there's individual accountability about our life, our death, and how we want it. But when we see that happening as well, at the same time, this is what the acceleration of that transition could mean.
So in other words, Christelle, it's an opportunity to reset. It's an opportunity to be courageous as well in order to reset. And, you know, maybe, and you know, again, we won't go into this, but maybe in a virtual world, it may be easier to say that than if you're sitting with someone. Who knows? But there's all sorts of different things in there that are coming into play, but of course, all of them very useful. It sounds like a very healthy discussion.
It was, and courageous for him. Yeah. Thank you.
Great. Good. Claire, can you see other hands?
Quick look. I think so. I've just been having a bit of a side Chantal as well, and I think something just has come to mind, which is one of the things that's coming out in this conversation that didn't come out 2 weeks ago, and I think is a really interesting shift, is that we're now talking about what we want to see, what we want to emerge in much more concrete terms. And I've just written down, you know, there seems to be a tension between what we want our leaders to be and where they are or who they are. And I just put that out there because in some ways, and I'm going to say something which is deliberately provocative, but maybe some of the things we're talking about and hoping for are equally designed to contain our anxiety because they require behaviors that some people cannot align to, and so they're more of a fantasy. And actually, how do we navigate that in this transitional space so that leaders, individuals, everyone takes their role, but in a way that isn't such a stretch that it takes them into a space that's so countercultural that they can't inhabit it?
Yeah. Well, it's a great place to break on, I think. It's a great question, and it is provocative, and I think it will give pause for thought. So why don't we then, Alicia, give people 10 minutes to go continue the conversations in the same group. Alicia, if you could share the screen, we're going to share a final question for you. And what I'm going to ask you to do with this question is essentially use a methodology that Martin Scorsese uses in the film world. When his team of writers and production assistants are struggling with a script, what he says is, okay, let us distill this movie down into one sentence. What is this movie about? What are we trying to project here? And then once they've come up with a sentence that they can all agree on, he then sends them back to go and do it in one word. What is this movie about? What does this movie mean in one word? Now, we're not going to ask you to do this in one word, but what we're going to ask you to do is to distill your conversation down into one sentence, okay? Just one sentence. So come back with a sentence in exactly 10 minutes, 26 past. What are we expecting the role of leaders to be in society, and how will it affect us all? Welcome back, everybody. Thank you. We're going to invite you actually to share your sort of distillation in one sentence. A representative from each group. Who's going to go first?
Who's group one, Alicia?
Group one has Avani, Christelle, Constance, and Aline.
Okay.
And Anita.
Christelle.
Yeah, we had a lot of debates about expectation, not expectation, but I'll go. We ended up like, if there's any expectation we have to have of a leader, it's to create a safe psychological space so that anxiety can be contained, individual accountability can be exercised, all the voices can be heard, and courageous individual can actually share work together. Great,
thank you. We're back to containment, which I think is very important. Okay, group two.
Group two is Georgina, Georgina, Guy, and Yuan.
Okay.
Okay, so I can go. So we basically came up with a few words.
Okay,
so the leader would be responsible. Parisia, what in Greek says somebody who speaks the truth.
Yeah.
Threshold, and there is a part of moving, a movement, a doing, or yeah, there is an action part there.
Yeah, some agility, some movement. Great, fantastic. Thanks, Dragana. Group three, Alicia.
Bettina, Evelyn, James, and Jerome.
Bettina, fill the screen with your telepresence.
Where is she?
Not there.
So actually we came up with one word.
It's
redistribution. So how can we redistribute? Because we talked about trust and about other stuff, but how can we make it a fair world and a fair organization?
Thank you. Group four.
Katie, Mark, Martine, Nell, and Audie.
Nell, I call on you again.
Okay. I've written it in the chat. To be loved and seen, to contain our anxieties, to give us hope and direction for the future, and accountability for the common good.
Wow.
Nice and wordy.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Very, very British. Okay, thank you. That's excellent. Thanks, Nell. Group five.
Group five is Juliet Marianne.
Okay.
And Giussini.
Gree, are you there?
I can talk. I mean, we had, our group was a little bit dominated by two of us who work with or are connected with family businesses. So we drifted off a little bit about how I started to talk about purpose, and then it just so happened that one of the members was sitting writing a thesis about purpose. So then, you know, we got a little stuck on that, even though that's a term which has been around for a bit. And then, of course, one other member had worked in a purpose-built or purpose-driven company, and then it was a discussion if that includes the collective care in its construct. Apart from the fact that the one who's a specialist on the purpose leadership there, she doesn't like the word. I mean, I'm clinging to it still. So that is a little bit where we ended up. So now I think it's frozen a bit here.
Oh, your gram is frozen.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll go for group 6.
Yeah, group 6 is with Diana, Katherine, and Yuki.
I guess I'll speak for the group. We went around a lot, again, around this idea of containment and what that means. But creating that psychological safety so that individuals can take that responsibility, and that there's an expectation set almost for that responsibility of figuring out where you are in the transition. Because from a leadership perspective, you can have different people at different stages. So around creating the space for that individual reflection and the fact that it's okay to be in different places than your team members.
Thank you. Group 7?
James, Mauricio, Pavez, Sebastian, and Selena.
Sebastian?
Okay, so I think our view were a bit diverging. So, but we talk about framework, bill of responsibilities, and lost in translation.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the first two is about a need of framework for the leaders, a need of the bill of responsibility, additionally to the bill of rights, and I mean, lost in translation, it was coming from me. I'm not expecting that the leaders will be lost, but that's my guess at the end of the day.
And
thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Finally, group 8.
Rodrigo, Virginia, and Daniel. So let's see.
You want me to go? I'll go.
Yeah.
So three sort of areas we covered was an openness in providing hope and direction, having really authentic relationships, and really collaborating for having constructive collaboration for a higher purpose. So again, constructive collaboration with differences. So we've seen a few examples coming out through COVID-19 with that. So the other three areas.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, Alicia, that's everybody, right? Okay, brilliant. So in that case, I want to first of all thank all of you for participating. It was wonderful to have you all along for this ride. Very provocative, very interesting remarks that you've made, questions that you've asked. Thank you for joining. Thanks to KDVI for opening up this space for all of us, and to Oriane and her team for doing that. Claire, thanks for being my sparring partner again. It's always great to sit with you and hear your ideas. Really interesting thinker, and it always makes me think too when I put the phone down. And Alicia, thanks for facilitating all of this on our behalf. Claire and I are Luddites. We can't do it without you, so it's really great to have you along as well. The final one of these, folks, before everyone goes, is going to be on Thursday, and it's around this very important topic of mental health, and we're only running one of them, so if you can come along for that one. Caroline Rook, who's done a lot of research around mental health and what it will mean for people emerging from this crisis, is going to be talking about that and hosting that discussion this coming Thursday. So we hope you can join for that. Meanwhile, take care of yourselves, be safe, look after each other, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.